1919 was an auspicious year in history. The First World War ended, ushering a drastic change in the world order. The Philippine Islands had been a U.S. territory for 2 decades and was promised independence under the Jones Law of 1916. Progressive reformers saw the country and its people as a major target for modernization, and education was its main weapon. 7 forward-looking Filipinas came together in 1919 to create a school where young women could gain the knowledge and skills that would make them modern women. Paz Marquez Benitez was the first president of the Philippine Women's College. Jose Abad Santos was its first chairman of the Board of Trustees. Francisca Tirona Benitez was the second president, and with her husband Dean Conrado, guided the school from a house on A. Flores Street to its iconic Taft Avenue campus. In 1932, the college became a university, making PWU the first university for women in Asia founded by Asians. It provided a space where innovations in education flourished, and young people were encouraged to be the best that they could be. For over 100 years, the Philippine Women's University has been known as a leader in quality education. In 1934, PWU moved into its main campus on Taft Avenue, and since the 1970s has been co-educational. Located in the heart of Metro Manila, it is easily accessible by public transport and surrounded by affordable housing. Today's PWU offers undergraduate and graduate courses in several fields of study. Its business and management programs are responsive to the needs of industry, using evolving technology for global competence. PWU graduates excel in arts and sciences, education, social work, and diplomacy. Its fine arts and music programs have produced outstanding graduates through a holistic education that treasures heritage as well as excellence. PWU has pioneered in fields such as food science, nutrition and dietetics, medical technology, pharmacy, and nursing. PWU continues to play an essential role in producing graduates who possess the skills that make them competitive in the country and anywhere in the world. "1919 was an
alanganan, alab ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, duyat ka ng magiting, sa manlulupig, di ka pasisiig, sa dagat at bundok, sa simoy at sa langit mong bukaw, may dilagang tulad, awit sa paglayang minamahal, ang kisap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagtitingin, ang bituin at araw niya kailan pa may di magdidinig, lupa ng araw ng at ipagsinta mo'y langit sa piling mo, aming ligaya dapat may mga aming ang mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Hello. Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is AK Okol. I am a practicing artist and I teach in PW Master of Fine Arts and Design. Today, I welcome everyone to PW School of Fine Arts and Design lecture series, What is an Avant Garde? The first of a three-part lecture series on the complex history of the avant garde. We are honored to have this event that enriches our engagement with other researchers in the arts and humanities. We would like to acknowledge first the presence of Dean Josephine Turalba, MFAD Coordinator Mervy Pueblo, our speaker, Dr. Thomas O. Hackinson, and the PW community, students, and teachers who are joining us today in this event. Before we start, may we remind everyone to remain muted at all times during the talk so as not to distract the whole event. We would also like for everyone to turn off their webcams in order to prevent possible any possible connection interruptions while the speaker is talking. As per Dr. Hackinson's preference, we will collect all questions in the FB Live and Google Meet for the questions and answers portion of at the end of the lecture. You may at any time type in your questions during the talk. We will also provide Dr. Thomas O. Hackinson's email should you want to engage him after the talk as well. In 1939, one of the canonical Western art theorists, Clement Greenberg, in his essay Avant Garde and the Kitsch, defined avant garde as an entity that rose against the consumerist mindset that led to the decline of cultural consumer sense of aesthetics and taste. However, as we view all artistic periods and movements from a historical distance, we then realize that each movement is almost always a movement against a decline of a particular taste. This then begs the question, what then is the avant-garde, especially as a colloquially misunderstood term? Where do we place avant-garde in the context of colonized countries who are both within and displaced from its influence? It gives me much pleasure to present to you Dr. Thomas O. Hackinson in his first lecture on the avant-garde, What is an Avant-Garde? Dr. Thomas O. Hackinson is an associate professor at California College of Arts in San Francisco, California, USA. His areas of scholarly interest include the artistic avant-garde, as well as the historical and cultural studies of science and technology. He holds degrees from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and Drake University. He has received awards and fellowships from the United States Fulbright Program, the Social Science Research Council, the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, the Deutscher Akademischer Austauschdienst, and the Berlin Program for Advanced German and European Studies, among others. Hackinson is co-editor of the book series Visual Cultures and German Context and has co-edited several anthologies, including Jürgen Habermas and the European Economic Crisis, Cosmopolitanism Reconsidered, the volume Representations of German Identity, and also the collection Becoming Trans-German, Cultural Identity Beyond Geography. His monograph Grotesque Visions, The Science of Berlin Dada was published in June of 2021 in the New Directions in German Studies series, and he also edited a volume with Dr. Jennifer L. Creech, due out in early 2022, titled How to Make the Body, Difference, Identity, and Embodiment with Jennifer L. Creech. I'm more than excited to learn from Dr. Hackinson as an educator and, of course, a perpetual student and practitioner of the arts.
Perpetual student for sure, AK. Thank you so much. I just want to say a big thank you to you, AK, for all your fantastic work in getting things set up today and getting me here today. So I really appreciate that. And let's go ahead and get started then on this talk, about 22 minutes or so. Okay. Roughly. What I hope to do is share with you the idea of a critical artistic practice called the Avant Garde and its history, a history that's problematic and somewhat troubling. This big that I'll be giving to you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation to join you this morning on Thursday, 16 September in Manila, the Philippines. I'm speaking with you from San Francisco and Sacramento, California on Wednesday evening, 15 September. It's a real pleasure to be here with you to talk about the Avant Garde in this first of 3 lectures that I'll be giving to you all at Philippine Women's University at the invitation of Mervy Pueblo. And a big, big thank you to Mervy in particular for inviting me to join you all here today and in the months ahead. Today's talk is addressed at the topic of what is an avant-garde. And in the next 15 or 20 minutes, roughly, what I hope to do is share with you the idea of a critical artistic practice called the avant-garde and its history, a history that's problematic and somewhat troubling. Today's lecture explains the origins of the concept avant-garde in the West and outlines what makes a work of art, design, media, or art, architecture avant-garde, at least in historical terms. Throughout this 3-part lecture series at Philippine Women's University, I'll address several different aspects of the Western concept of the avant-garde. For today's talk, I'm going to focus on the idea of the Western Enlightenment, which lasted from about 715 to 1789, but has reverberations even today in the social, political, cultural fabric of the West and beyond. I'll also address briefly the idea of the utopian socialists who were active in the early 1800s and explain specifically which figures were important, key foundational advocates of what we consider to be an artistic avant-garde, historically and in today's terms. And finally, I want to address the specific text in which the concept of an avant-garde is first introduced in 1825. In the next two lectures, one which will take place in October and the third in November, I'll address the other topics you see here on the screen, which move us from aestheticism in the arts through World War I and World War II, the concept of an historical avant-garde, as well as the Dada movement specifically, onto Neo-Dada after World War II, and then the concept of the avant-garde as it operates today in the West and globally. Key for understanding the development of the artistic avant-garde in the West is the Enlightenment period. This particular political and intellectual cultural movement occurred from about 1714 to 1789, and it had wide-reaching implications for Europe and North America. Sometimes considered primarily a political and intellectual cultural movement, the Enlightenment also led to things like the modern nation state, the American Revolution, which lasted from 1774 to 1781, and the French Revolution, which lasted from approximately 1789 to 1799, are two examples of the political effects, the political results that emerged from the Enlightenment's emphasis on individual thinking, individual reason, and individual sovereignty, self-government. Germany is also an important figure here for us, but it had a rather conflicted emergence as a nation state. It first became an imperial federation or monarchy in 1870, 1871, when several different principalities were united in what is similar to the present-day scope and shape of Germany. And then, of course, Germany became a democratic republic after World War I in 1918 and 1919. And I emphasize these particular historical events because they will have direct implications for the avant-garde in Europe and Dada in particular, as we'll see in the lectures throughout the next couple of months. I've also given an image here on the screen that represents some of the anxieties, the issues, the concerns in a visual artistic fashion in a rather famous etching by Francisco Goya called The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters, completed in 1797 to 1799. And here you'll see Goya or his substitute asleep at the desk with the phrase on the side that reads, "The sleep of reason produces monsters." And these creatures in the background, these birds and owls and wild lynx, sort of hovering, approaching, to suggest that perhaps when we're asleep, when we individuals rest and don't use our critical capacities or abilities to reason, then all sorts of wild, animalistic, monstrous things might actually occur. An individual that is very important in terms of the aesthetic avant-garde, the artistic avant-garde, and its emergence in the 1900s is Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher who lived from 1724 to 1804. Among the many texts that Kant wrote, the critiques of reason, of judgment, and taste in particular, he helped build a framework for the use of sense perception and immediate comprehension that would lead in his scenario to a higher order of thinking, of a reasonable individual critical capacity. And this is sometimes what we associate with the rational Western subject, which emerged out of these Enlightenment texts and from the thoughts of these thinkers, Immanuel Kant included. And I have here on the screen a portrait by Johann Gottlieb Becker from 1768 of Kant, as well as one of the many key quotes that we might take from Kant's texts to demonstrate this hierarchy or this integration of three modalities of comprehension that were key to Kant's systematization of knowledge. Kant said, quote, "All our knowledge begins with the senses, proceeds then to the understanding, and ends with reason. There is nothing higher than reason." So certainly today, even as we privilege the idea of a rational subject, a subject that can make rational decisions, we already see a kind of hierarchy emerging here in Kant's thought, albeit a hierarchy that does privilege and recognizes the senses, taste, vision, touch, and the role that these faculties play in human understanding of the world around us. Now, Kant had many, many complex ideas, and his texts are difficult and engaging and wonderful and challenging to read. But one of the ideas that I think is really important for us as we consider the development of the artistic avant-garde in the West is Kant's emphasis on how to change the way we individual humans understand the world around us and our place in it. And Kant at times comes across as a kind of idealistic thinker, but I think it's also important to emphasize that he's talking about ways in which our understanding of the world transform through interaction with each other. And this quote is particularly helpful in understanding how later thinkers, the utopian socialists and Henri de Saint-Simon in particular, take up Kant's thought and see within artistic practice, within something that gets called an avant-garde, an important vehicle for transforming the world. So here I have a quote from Kant that reads, "A revolution may bring about the end of a personal despotism or of avaricious tyrannical oppression, but never a true reform of modes of thought. New prejudices will serve in place of the old as guidelines for the unthinking multitude. The public use of one's reason must be free at all times, and this alone can bring enlightenment to mankind." So Kant is very concerned with our ability to transform our thinking and the thinking of others, how we as a collective, as a public, engage one another to come to rational conclusions about the world around us and make rational decisions using our own sense of the world. That includes our sense of touch, taste, smell, sound, and also our own reason, our own understanding. Kant's ideas about enlightenment and the individual's ability to use sensory perception, understanding, and reason to inform a collective practice of self-governance and a collective understanding approach to the world around us are difficult, they're complex, and they've been debated for hundreds of years in the West. But I find this quote by Richard Murphy from a fairly recent text helpful in understanding what exactly happened during the Enlightenment in the West and what exactly Kant's thought and others who were writing in similar fashion to Kant did in terms of how humans and individuals were engaging the world around them. And this quote from Richard Murphy contains a reference to Karen Littau's theories of reading, and I've given both references at the bottom of the screen if you'd like to engage these texts further. The part of Murphy's quote that I think is helpful is highlighted. In the Enlightenment, there's a turn away from the classical emphasis on rhetoric as the art of persuasion and as the means by which discourse can exert an influence upon the world. And instead, there is an increasing tendency to view the aesthetic as a value in its own right. As Karen Littau discerns, quote, "The greater emphasis on affect as opposed to effect signals a retreat from a public into a more intimate sphere, the private world of emotions and sensations," end quote. And what develops here, of course, is a new conception of human subjectivity, now defined increasingly according to the values of understanding, emotion, and individualism, end quote. Here you see Murphy and Litau emphasizing the way in which the senses and the emotion are key factors in this new subject, this new kind of human self-understanding that emerges out of the Western Enlightenment. And this new self-understanding, this new kind of subjectivity, has implications for the arts, insofar as the arts themselves are seen as having a very important value in their own right. They serve a particular function in the West as a reflection on the society in which they are produced and received and discussed and viewed. There were many conflicting ideas that developed from Enlightenment thought and Kant's approach to aesthetics, to what he called a judgment of taste in particular. One group, called sometimes pejoratively the utopian socialists, is a very important case study for us when we think about the development of the concept of the avant-garde. And I say so-called utopian socialists because although oftentimes they referred to themselves with that moniker, the word utopian was used by others in a pejorative sense, that is, an unrealizable kind of social organization. And the utopian socialists were active from about 1830 to 1848 and were part of an idealistic cultural and political movement. And by idealistic, I mean in contrast to later thinkers like Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, who would also take up some of Kant's ideas, but suggest that class struggle and political revolution were necessary for social change. For the utopian socialists, however, writing in the early 1900s, class struggle or political revolution was not necessary for society to change. Instead, many of the advocates of utopian socialist thinking encouraged what they called, or was called by others, cooperative socialism, a socialism taken up by like-minded people within existing societies that could demonstrate the feasibility of their socialist plan of organization and communal living. Here I've given you on the screen an engraving by an artist named F. Bate of Robert Owen's short-lived utopian community in New Harmony, Indiana. Now, this engraving is from 1838, and Robert Owen was a colleague of Henri de Saint-Simon and several other important utopian socialists. But it is Henri de Saint-Simon who is really important for us in charting the history of the concept of an aesthetic avant-garde. He was a key figure in the utopian socialist movement, a French political, economic, and social theorist, and a businessman. He emphasized in his work socioeconomic relations and the Enlightenment pursuit of scientific knowledge. And here I give you a portrait by Hippolyte Ravergy from 1848 of Henri de Saint-Simon, whose full name was Claude-Henri de Rouvroy, Comte de Saint-Simon. And Saint-Simon was active during Kant's lifetime, born in 1760, but passed in 1825. I want to conclude my brief historical overview of the emergence of the avant-garde with Henri de Saint-Simon today. And his work sets the stage for us as we start to think in the next lectures in October about the Western avant-garde and its development, and then in November about the rise of what German philosopher and social theorist Peter Berger famously described as the historical avant-garde, and a kind of avant-garde that Peter Berger associates in particular with the Dada art movement. And that will be our lecture for November. But Henri de Saint-Simon is important in the trajectory of our understanding of the artistic avant-garde for many reasons, most importantly of which is the fact that he was the first to associate the arts with a kind of vanguard thinking. The term avant-garde comes from a French military concept of an advanced troop, an advanced group of soldiers who go ahead of the rest of the military force to chart the territory, to see the path, to find out what lies ahead and report back to those in the larger group. And with this concept, Henri de Saint-Simon found something very important and a metaphor, but also a very actual role for the artist to play in the emerging kind of social fabric that he saw arising from the Enlightenment, and that he and his utopian socialist colleagues thought would emerge from the Enlightenment thinking of Kant and others. And it was in a text from 1825, around the year of his, that Henri de Saint-Simon crystallizes this kind of idea for the arts, and the vanguard writes about three figures that are important to the developing social fabric he sees, and that is the artist, the scientist, and the industrialist. And these three types, these three figures, will all cooperate in Saint-Simon's scenario to build the kind of community, the kind of fabric that he sees as so important for collective living. But it is the artist that plays the most significant role. Now, I want to just note before I read this quote from this text from 1825, that the attribution of these ideas are still to this day somewhat debated. But many scholars, historians, philosophers agree that this text, these ideas, must have come from Henri de Saint-Simon. So let me read this important paragraph. This is the first time in which the arts are associated with the idea of a vanguard or an avant-garde. And this is the text from 1825 called The Artist, the Scientist, and the Industrialist. Henri de Saint-Simon. Quote, "It is we artists who will serve as your vanguard. The power of the arts is indeed most immediate and the quickest. We possess arms of all kinds. When we want to spread new ideas among men, we inscribe them upon marble or upon a canvas. We popularize them through poetry and through song. We employ by turns the lyre and the flute, the ode and the song, the story and the novel. The dramatic stage is spread out before us, and it is there that we exert a galvanizing and triumphant influence. We address ourselves to man's imagination and to his sentiments. We therefore ought always to exert the most lively and decisive action. And while today our role seems non-existent, or at least quite secondary, that is because the arts are missing what is essential to their energy, to success, a shared impulse and a general idea." End quote. De Saint-Simon and other advocates of an artistic avant-garde that emerged from his ideas and ideas circulating in the 19th century, it was in fact the role of the arts to spearhead social change and to reflect on social conditions and political realities and challenges. That was that central impulse, that general idea that they could pursue together, that these artists could pursue together. So with that in mind, remember Henri de Saint-Simon in 1825 is a key moment for us as we think about the emergence of the term avant-garde and what an artistic avant-garde meant initially when the term was first employed in such fashion in 1825. Let me conclude today by thanking you once again for joining me as I've walked you through some key historical developments in the emergence of an artistic avant-garde as a concept in 1825. I shared with you a bit of history about the Western Enlightenment and the thinking of Immanuel Kant in particular. We talked about the utopian socialists, the kind of potentially negative term utopian, who were active in the 1800s, and Henri de Saint-Simon in particular, who was a key figure in the utopian socialist thinking, as well as in identifying the concept of an artistic vanguard or an artistic avant-garde in his 1825 text that carries with it, even to this day, the implication of an artistic vision that appeals to the senses, that can change people's minds, that can influence social, political, and cultural values in many, many ways. So please do join me for the talks in October and November when we'll discuss how the avant-garde as a concept develops and how it continues to be functional and useful today in its various forms. With that in mind, thank you again for joining me. And I believe we have some time for discussion and questions yet today. I look forward to hearing from you. Hopefully everything came out okay on your side.
It was pretty much okay here. I might have a question since nobody has a question. Oops.
Is it gonna involve Clement Greenberg? That was a wonderful.
No.
Oh no. Okay.
Or it could be. I was just because you mentioned how the term utopian is also flexible, right? And I can't help but think of that famous the famous Met Gala dress and how artists tend to think that they can, at least with the avant-garde, they tend to think that, oh, we will be the frontliners for things. But then especially in the contemporary times, we kind of see how that sensibility or idealism just falls. Like, how do I explain it? It's like there is some kind of problem when, I don't know, personally, when artists think that they can maybe save the world, or is that just idealism that falls in that questionable utopian idealism?
It's a lot of pressure too on the poor artists, right? On you poor artists to save the world all the time. But it's also a big challenge. And I love that you mentioned the Met Gala. If you've not seen from I think just this past weekend, culturally was a pretty amazing moment with the I think the MTV Video Music Awards on I think Saturday and then Sunday, or maybe it was yesterday. The week has sort of went by. The Met Gala with the fantastic sort of haute couture, amazing outfits. It makes me think a lot about this concept that comes up later in the 1800s, with Richard Wagner and the idea of a Gesamtkunstwerk, which Clement Greenberg also kind of plays with for his part. And I think kind of, one development for the artistic kind of avant-garde was this idea that the artist sort of incorporates and embraces all art forms and produces this new totality that then in and of itself transforms the world. So you see that with Richard Wagner, the composer's, the opera composer's idea of a Gesamtkunstwerk, a work that in its totality incorporates all the kind of sensory experiences and therefore sort of overwhelms the viewer listener and helps transform our thinking. But on a kind of maybe less grandiose scale, you get that also from things like the Met Gala and from MTV and the Video Music Awards, when you have figures who are no longer, just a musician. We are certainly in a moment in the 21st century, and we have been in the 20th century as well, and maybe even before that, where the artist is no longer just a singer or just a painter. You carry with you a whole apparatus of influence. And now I think more than ever, social media, thinking about branding and self-representation in multiple formats. I have trouble navigating, Google Meet calls and Zoom calls. And now we are all, and you artists in particular, are doing websites and multiple platforms in addition to the kind of skill and craft you apply to a particular kind of studio practice, perhaps. So I think there is a kind of return to that holistic idea just of necessity, and this maybe has a lot to do with Greenberg, to circle back with him and his idea of the avant-garde as a response to capitalist sort of commodification of the arts, and the avant-garde is responding critically to that kind of capitalist push. I think we sort of see today the demands that the artists take on many roles, oftentimes in the name of self-representation and branding, but perhaps there's also critical potential to change people's views and thoughts about certain kinds of things in the world. And of a moment, some of you may be following Little Nas X. I'm sort of fascinated with him as a performer and what he's sort of doing across multiple formats.
Yes.
To those ends. So, but I'm not just about Kant, is it? So it's a very good question. AK, thanks for asking. Hopefully it sort of answered a little bit.
I also like Lil Nas X. I was actually looking into, of course, how Greenberg kind of defined it as a rise against the consumerist mindset, but at the same time, and with the intro we made for this presentation, like it seems like all movements are also against a specific mindset, or like that consumerist mindset at that time. Or yeah, I was wondering about that.
Well,
like from a historical distance.
Yeah, I mean, I too sort of struggle. I often reduce, unfortunately, I think the avant-garde to an anti-capitalist sort of artistic practice, and that's not. I don't think that's a fair representation of the avant-garde historically or in the present moment. So historically, one of the examples I can offer you is the book you mentioned that just came out called Grotesque Visions, The Science of Berlin Dada. And what I really wanted to do in that book is just talk a lot about the artists that have been associated with the avant-garde in early 20th century Europe, the Berlin Dadaist in particular. And there are a couple of figures that I talk about a lot in the book. They were very concerned with things like scientific empiricism and medical pathology and cellular pathology and anthropology. So they were concerned with things not necessarily focusing on an anti-capitalist message in their work. And in that sense, I feel like they sort of have been forgotten, and their critical strategies have been a little bit less recognized than even some of the Berlin Dadaists like John Hartfield and George Gross and Raoul Hausmann, who some folks may know, were very visible. In part, John Hartfield and George Gross are a great example because they were so visibly present in the illustrated magazines in Europe of the early 20th century with their critiques of the National Socialists and of capitalism and the way those things were sort of working together. And then in the present moment, somebody who I'm really still quite fascinated with is an artist named Adam Pendleton. And I may make mention of him in November when we chat a bit more about Dada, his project, which emerged in 2007, 2008, called Black Dada, has really sort of taken up the Black Power movement of the 1950s and 60s in the US and sort of integrated it with some of the Dada, early 20th century Dada strategies and tactics. And his work right now, he has a show opening in about a week in the Museum of Modern Art in New York City, in which he sort of deconstructs the museum from the inside in a very interesting way. And so I think there are strategies in which capitalism isn't always the focus of the avant-garde. And as much as I sort of love hate is a strong word, love and concerned about Greenberg and his perspective of the avant-garde and its relationship to capitalism, I like to sort of think about the avant-garde as a more complex phenomena than just a critique of capitalism, however narrowly we define the term capitalism in this sense.
Okay. I think if there's anything that baffles me, I guess, like, not sure if this question is reserved for the future, the other two lectures, but like the avant-garde seems like, for me, it seems like distance, especially with colonized countries like the Philippines. Like at some point, I don't know how to place it there, like its influence because we're, at least in colonized histories, we're only having the residue of that influence. So I think it becomes problematic. Oh, there are questions here.
Yeah, they all popped up very quickly, so I'm just taking some notes.
Yeah, I guess we should read it. So this one comes from Ethan David with regards to the Met Gala and the topic
Yeah.
of the avant-garde. Where do we draw the line between art and bringing about social change? Oh, I love that question.
Yeah,
One of
it's
the
also.
attendees, actress. Yes, sir.
Oh no, sorry. Go ahead, AK. I'm sorry.
Oh, one of the attendees, actress and activist India Moore, said that we organize millions for a museum on stolen land that black and brown people suffer on. Can't we be substantially generous in ways that alleviate suffering and poverty?
Really an excellent question, and Ethan, I certainly appreciate you kind of sharing that. And the quote by India Moore in particular. I think India is India the artist. She was in the Netflix series Pose. Am I correct? Yep. Thank you so much. It's a great show. And also, I think it relates a little bit to Noel's question, who also touches on the issue of colonialism and post-colonialism. One of the things is, recognizing that history of exploitation is key, and I think historically has not been visible as it has been, I think, in the recent past, and that's a really fantastic development. Artists like India Moore and others, and local organizations, certainly here in the Bay Area, we're experiencing a really important recognition of the history of colonialism, of indigenous populations, the territories in which we occupy, the institutions that were built on those territories that were stolen. So that recognition is super important. The thing that I will say is there's a concept that comes from anthropology. I'm thinking back specifically. It's Johannes Fabian. No, apologies. It comes from two thinkers named Peter Stallerbras and Alan White, and they talk about. And they're offering up a critique of capitalist structures, and they're doing it from the lens of a history of the phenomenon of the grotesque, which is related a little bit to the book project, because the title is Grotesque Vision, so I talk a little bit about their work. But the idea that Stallerbras and White have is they put forward a critique of what they call displaced abjection, and that is rather than addressing, and I'm not saying Moore is doing this, I think. Hopefully I didn't freeze. I lost audio for a second, but the idea of displaced abjection is the idea of, and we see this quite common in political discourse as well, where rather than building coalitions to address a larger phenomena and perhaps change, structures of exploitation, there is kind of a pointing fingers among folks who are in positions of suppression or who are being exploited. And this happens, if you're into political discourse in the US, we get a lot of discussions of that around elections as well, why people vote against their interests, basically. And there's oftentimes a kind of political baiting that happens. This person is, I'm not going to vote even though I'll pay less in taxes because this thing or this individual candidate is although aligned with my, would help me with healthcare costs. I'm not going to vote for that candidate because they may think that immigration is an important topic and want to increase quotas or whatever it is. So I really like the idea of displaced abjection here to think about, because we are talking about conversations among oppressed populations. That said, going back to the quote that you all shared about from India Moore, and just saying that there's a lot of money out there, and certainly museums receive more money than social justice organizations for the most part at the grassroots and local level. But we also have, I think bigger targets of that kind of financial exploitation. Don't use Amazon is the message. But that's I shouldn't say that. Sorry, but there's that. So just be mindful. I mean, those calling to consciousness kind of moves are very important. But we also don't want to lose track of who are allies and institutions that help spread those kinds of messages, and who are the organizations that are benefiting, sometimes behind the scenes. So that's a little bit toward, and I'll talk a little bit more about maybe some of the post-colonial initiatives around the avant-garde. I think when we get in probably closer to the issue of colonialism in the next talk in October, I'll talk a little bit about the colonial situation in World War II, and then the catalysts as we move into November to talk specifically about historical Dada and then more contemporary Dada initiatives like Dada in South Africa, which was about a response to apartheid in the 60s. So that helps a little bit. Sorry, AK, you picked the next ones, or I don't know how much more time we have.
How many questions are you willing to take? We have around 1, 2, 3, 4 extra questions.
Yeah.
We could probably pick maybe, do you want to answer 2 more or 3?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Here's another one from Gabriel. Interesting point about Kesamgun's work. With this, can the role of an artist as the contemplative, ritualistic individual still exist today? Or does this inform us that artists should continue to assume more of a designer role, thinking more about the function of art rather than its capacity to be a receptacle of meaning?
It's tough. I think one of the things I'm really fascinated about, Gabrielle, so thank you for sharing that really, really good question. I'm really fascinated about the concept of time with respect to the avant-garde. And this isn't something I'll talk a lot about now. I'm going to be I'll do a talk with some colleagues in October 8th about time in the avant-garde. And I think my point here is that the issue of temporality, of the idea of time for reflecting and understanding one situation before like acting, and the immediacy now that I think a lot of us feel we don't really have time to reflect and think through. We simply need to act. I think there's an important sort of parallel happening with the idea of, I sort of wanted to pull that out in Kant a little bit about the idea of affect, about the felt response to things versus the kind of more in the Kant kind of problematic Kant hierarchy, the rational reflective moment. So I think there is something really to be gained at the level of affect, of AFFECT, that is the felt immediacy response. And, sometimes we kind of joke or talk about it in terms of an intuition or just a gut feeling, but this idea that an artist is operating, and we all are operating, with a kind of extra immediate sense of how to respond to things around us. And if you've done any work with affect theory, you kind of know where I'm headed, but people like Brian Masumi and Lauren Berlant, Brian Masumi's work in particular, I think is really fascinating here, talking about, where is the time to kind of have this sort of reflection as an artist, and I think I'm just looking at the question as I'm talking, and so that's sort of you're needing to respond to immediate situations, but also trying to keep in mind what is my role. There's also this discourse about meditation and taking time, and self-care is a term we use a lot at my institution. Like, how do you navigate that terrain as an artist? It's not easy, and I can't offer up an exact solution, but what I really want to get at is there's a knowledge that I think even in the Enlightenment stuff, which is fuddy-duddy and old and 300 years past, is still kind of helpful for me in terms of thinking about giving ourselves a recognition that the senses produce a kind of knowledge for us that isn't the kind of knowledge that historically has been called even knowledge. It's just, suppressing the senses because you need to think through and you think rationally. But I think, the artistic dimensions of the avant-garde that I tried to pull out a little bit today really do call up the idea of the senses as a key way to think through situations, and of affect in particular, of AFFECT. So you get that Richard Murphy quote from the Karen Littau text about affect versus effect is kind of key. So this is sort of a response, but we could talk a lot more about that. It's a really good question, Gabriel.
Okay. It seems like we can extend for a little bit. Are you okay answering another question, Sir Thomas?
Oh, it's okay. Yeah, AK, you can call me Tom. It's okay.
Ano?
Yeah, well, I can answer one more question maybe, and then my dogs are gonna probably bite my ankles and say, "Let's go."
Okay. Okay. So, how about this one? From my understanding, the avant-garde artists created non-objective art to oppose bourgeois taste or the tastemaker institution. At the present time, our avant-garde artists today were also against bourgeois taste. And bourgeois taste mean mainstream art?
Yeah, it's a good question as well. I think it's sort of hitting at something that I really want to talk a lot about when we get to the Dada stuff in a couple of months, actually November. But thinking through the focus of so much of the critical practice of the artists in the 1910s and 1920s, including the Dadaists that we think about under the umbrella of this term historical avant-garde that I mentioned, Peter Berger, is that they were reacting to the kind of visible, visceral destruction of World War One and trench warfare in particular. And so you see these artists really sort of kind of going after the bourgeois, the kind of status quo bourgeois state, like this kind of uncritical belief that even the Enlightenment ideas themselves were without flaw and without problems. And I'll talk a little bit about the Berlin Conference to colonize Africa next month in October, because it's an important background of the World War II, World War One stuff of this conference in 1883, 1884, in which European powers got together to see how to divide up Africa as a continent to colonize. And I bring that up simply because I think, kind of circling back to maybe my response to one of the earlier questions, is that there is a very particular kind of target within the early avant-garde and with early Dada in particular, and non-objective art. I mean, thinking about Marcel Duchamp and the Fountain, ready-mades. Even that history is sort of problematic. If you've ever heard of this person, Baroness von Freytag, Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, who was a performance artist and visual artist in her own right in New York in the 1910s. There's been a lot of good scholarship lately that Duchamp sort of stole her ideas when he made the ready-made. So in as much as I just say that because there's a history to some of the things we take for granted as well. Like this is a paradigmatic example of the non-objective art form and the way in which certain kind of, in this case, for the most part, heterosexual male, white male developed this art form. In fact, there was this woman, Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven, which some folks have really tried to kind of call out and describe as important. So, but much like that, there's kind of a history. Sometimes we don't know it about the avant-garde, and so I think it's not, as I mentioned with respect to the book, the Grotesque Vision stuff, there are artists who are engaged in criticisms of gender politics and colonialism and certainly of scientific practices at the time. So there's a lot there to dig into, and I know we won't have tons of time, but hopefully a little taste here in the next couple of months. AK, is that okay?
Yeah, that's pretty good. Your dogs might. Your dogs demand your attention now. Yeah, there was a nice question about post-colonialism, but I think that's something we need to unpack in your next lecture.
Yeah.
I'm excited to hear that. So thank you again, Tom, for this nice lecture. Especially to everyone. Yes?
Yeah, and thank you, AK and Murphy and everybody at PWU. I really appreciate this invitation. It's quite fantastic to be with you all.
Yeah, you're awesome for lending us your generous time from the other side of the world. And thank you, everyone, despite the technical difficulties we've been having. Thank you for attending the first of the series. Again, we really, really thank you, Dr. Hackinson, for generously offering your expertise. So may we remind everyone that this is the first of a three-part series. The second series, which will be held on October 14, 2021, will be focusing on understanding the Western avant-garde. And the third one, Dada and the Historical Avant-Garde, on November 25, 2021. We would like to invite you again on this event, so please stay tuned. and subscribe and follow our social media channels so you get to see the invitations. Thank you, Sir Hackinson. We will now proceed with the university hymn. Again, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.